Hi, I'm Elowin. 3 months ago, my parents looked at me across the dinner table and said, "You fat, useless thing. You've disgraced this family." Everyone laughed, except me. That night, they threw my suitcase into the rain and told me I was no longer their child, that the house belonged to my sister now. I walked away soaking wet, shaking, humiliated. But life has a strange way of turning, because now the empire they built on cruelty is collapsing, and the same people who threw me out, they're standing at my door, begging for help. Would you let them in, or finally let them feel what silence sounds like? Before we dive in, tell me, where are you listening from tonight? Because this isn't just my story. It's what happens when family turns into strangers. The air that evening smelled like rain and roses, one of those Texas springs that couldn't decide between calm and storm. I remember gripping the steering wheel as I turned into my parents' driveway, my fingers leaving faint prints of sweat on the leather. I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror and tried a smile. It looked rehearsed, the kind you practice before walking into a room where you're not really wanted. They only see what they want, I whispered to myself. Be quiet, be polite, it keeps the peace. Inside, the house was buzzing. Laughter echoed down the hall, the clinking of silverware chiming like a soundtrack to a life I'd never quite belonged to. The smell of roast beef and garlic bread should have been comforting, but instead it made me feel small, like I was walking into someone else's celebration. The dining room glowed under a chandelier that looked newer than the one I remembered. Family portraits lined the walls, vacations, graduations, business galas, not a single photo of me. Sable was at the head of the table, perfectly lit, hair shining like she'd just stepped out of a magazine. "Allowin'," she sang, rising to kiss the air near my cheek. "You made it!" I smiled the way I'd practiced. "Wouldn't miss it." Her husband, Lance, poured himself another glass of wine and smirked. "We were starting to think you got lost. I mean, GPS doesn't usually lead people in circles, unless it's trying to count the calories burned." The table burst into laughter. A clean, practiced kind of laugh. The kind that says, "We all know this joke isn't funny, but we'll pretend anyway." My mother didn't look up. My father cleared his throat and said, "Lance, that's enough." But his lips curved, betraying him. I reached for my water glass, trying to steady my breath. "I didn't realize calorie jokes were part of dinner now," I said softly. "Is that the theme?" Silence fell, heavy and brief before Sable jumped in. "Oh, Elle, relax. He was just teasing." "Sure," I murmured. "Everyone loves a little entertainment at dinner." The food arrived, perfectly cooked steak, mashed potatoes smoothed like silk. I ate quietly, cutting small pieces I barely tasted. The conversation flowed around me like a current I couldn't swim against. Business deals, new cars, Sable's promotion to regional director. Then my father stood, glass in hand. "A toast," he announced, his voice thick with pride. "To our pride and joy, Sable. Your hard work makes this family proud. And to Elowin." He paused, the room waiting. "For trying." Laughter again, louder this time. Sable reached across the table, her tone sweet as syrup. "We love you, Elle. Just maybe love yourself more, The sound that left my throat wasn't a word. It was something like a breath cut in half. I folded my napkin, each corner perfectly aligned, and placed it on the table. "Thank you," I said, "for reminding me where I stand." The laughter stopped. Chairs creaked. Even the chandelier seemed to dim. My father's hand twitched as if to stop me, but he didn't. I walked to the front door. My shoes clicked against the tile like a metronome, counting down to something inevitable. Outside, thunder rolled. I'd barely reached my car when my father's voice cut through the storm. "You embarrassed us tonight," he shouted from the doorway. Always playing the victim, always making things about you. I turned. Rain had begun to fall, sharp and cold. I didn't say anything you didn't hand me first. He stepped out, face red with fury. You've disgraced this family long enough. Get out. Don't come back until you learn some respect. Something inside me cracked, but it wasn't my heart. It was restraint. You mean until I disappear again, I said. He threw my suitcase into the driveway, its contents spilling into puddles. My mother appeared behind him, her eyes wide but empty. She didn't move. She looked at me, I would later recall, the way you look at someone already gone. The rain came harder. My clothes clung to me, heavy as guilt. I knelt to gather my things, a shoe, a sweater, a photo from years ago of the four of us smiling. The ink began to bleed, colors fading into gray. I didn't look back when I walked away. Each step splashed louder than the last, the thunder matching my heartbeat. By the time I reached the end of the street, the house behind me was just a blur of light in the downpour. I didn't know it yet, but that night, their house stopped being my home. By the time I reached the bus station, the rain had stopped, but the world still felt soaked through. The air was thick with leftover dampness, and my shoes squished with every step. I didn't have a plan, just a suitcase that barely zipped, $23 in my pocket, and the echo of my father's words still stinging behind my eyes. Inside the station, people moved like shadows, quiet, hurried, not making eye contact. I found a small cafe tucked into the corner of the terminal. The lights buzzed softly overhead, casting a pale glow over empty tables and plastic menus. I sank into a booth by the window, sliding my suitcase underneath the table. My reflection stared back at me in the glass, framed by a fog of condensation. It's strange. When you lose everything, even your reflection looks like a stranger. I pulled out the small, battered notebook I'd started keeping a few months ago. Inside were job postings torn from newspapers, clumsy sketches of apartment layouts I'd never afford, and pages of things I told myself when everything else fell apart. You're enough. You can start over. Breathe. The pages were wrinkled and smudged, as if the ink had tried to run away from the truth. I didn't notice the man behind the counter watching me until he set a cup of coffee on the table without saying a word. Just a simple mug. No frills, no charge. I looked up, and for a second I thought he might ask me to move along, like everyone else eventually did. I didn't order anything, I said quietly. I know, he replied. His voice was steady, low, like someone used to silence. You looked like you could use it. My instinct was to push it away. Pride is a funny thing. It shows up even when you've got nothing left to stand on. I'm not a charity case. He didn't flinch. Neither was I when someone did the same for me. I hesitated, hand wrapped around the warm ceramic. People don't give you things for free, not unless they want something. Maybe, he said softly, or maybe I just know what drowning in silence feels like. I took a sip. The coffee wasn't great, a little bitter, a little thin, but it was hot. And I realized I hadn't felt warmth since I'd stepped out of that house. He didn't hover, didn't ask questions, just nodded once and walked back behind the counter. For the next half hour, I sat there staring at the same page in my notebook, letting the heat of the mug seep into my hands. Eventually, he came back with a towel. "Shoes are still wet," he said. "You can borrow this if you want." I let out a breath that almost sounded like a laugh. I'm not used to people being nice without a reason. He sat across from me. I lost my wife 3 years ago. Same rain, same corner of this city. She used to say that kindness was the only real currency left in the world. I looked at him for the first time, not just glanced, really looked. His eyes were tired but kind, the kind of tired that doesn't come from lack of sleep, but from holding on when it would have been easier to let go. "What happened to her?" I asked. He folded his hands together. "Cancer. Fast. Cruel." We sat there for a long while without speaking. Just the hum of the fridge and the distant announcement of arriving buses. It was the first silence in days that didn't feel heavy. When I finally stood to leave, unsure where to go next, he called out, "If you're looking for work," he said, "I could use help around here. Nothing fancy, just until you figure things out." I froze. No one had ever offered me something without a catch, without a sigh, without reminding me I should be grateful. I looked down at my reflection in the metal napkin holder, hair frizzy, face pale, eyes rimmed red. I barely recognized the woman looking back. Maybe it's not pity. Maybe it's a start. "Okay," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "But just until I find something else." He smiled. "That's what everyone says." As I walked behind the counter, my wet shoes squeaked against the tile. A faint, awkward noise that made both of us grin without saying why. I reached for a dish rag and started wiping down the counter like I'd done it 100 times. My hands knew the motion. My mind was still catching up. It wasn't much, but for once, I was walking toward something. The weeks passed like soft footsteps in an empty hallway. I hadn't noticed how time crept when there were no explosions, no shouting, no sharp edges in the air. Just the steady rhythm of opening the cafe, wiping down counters, warming croissants, and handing regulars their usual orders with a quiet smile. Every day, I woke up at 6, tied my apron at 7, and watched the sun spill through the front windows by 8. I didn't think about what I'd lost as much anymore. Instead, I focused on the warmth of routine, the comfort of small tasks that didn't ask much from me, but slowly gave something back. Houston started to feel less like a punishment and more like a quiet corner I could breathe in. Then the bell over the door rang. It was late morning. The scent of cinnamon rolls filled the air, and a group of retired teachers sat in the corner, discussing someone's nephew getting into dental school. I had just finished wiping table 5 when I looked up and froze. Sable. She was dressed in white, tailored, spotless, glowing like she always did. Her hair was pulled into that high ponytail she knew made her look 10 years younger. The same smile she wore at that dinner, like nothing could ever really touch her. "Ellie?" Her voice was bright, too bright. "Oh my God, what are you doing here?" For a second, I forgot how to stand. Then I straightened, wiped my hands on the towel tucked in my apron, and forced myself to breathe. "I work here," I said simply. Her eyes scanned the room, registering every inch of the cafe. Her gaze paused on the pastry case, the menu board, then settled back on me like I was a curious surprise at the end of a museum tour. "I told Mom you'd land on your feet," she said. "You always do, eventually." I didn't answer. I just nodded and gestured toward the counter. "Would you like something to drink?" She smiled wider. "A latte, extra foam. You remember how I like it." That word, remember, landed like a slap. I remembered plenty. I remembered her laughter when Dad made that toast. I remembered her silence when I packed my bags in the rain. I turned toward the machine. My hands moved automatically, scooping the grounds, packing them, hitting the steam wand. But I felt it, the tremble, just under my skin. Sable strolled to a table, pulling out her phone. She angled it toward the counter. A soft click. Another. "What are you doing?" I asked, keeping my back turned. "Oh, just sending a pic to Mom. She wanted to see where you ended up." I clenched the milk pitcher tighter. The cafe suddenly felt too small, like the walls were inching in. Behind me, the frother hissed. The white noise usually calmed me. Today, it felt like static buzzing in my ears. I set the latte down in front of her. "Here you go." She didn't touch it right away, just looked at me over the rim of her phone. "You look good," she said, which really meant you don't look as terrible as I expected. Before I could answer, Harlan stepped out from the kitchen. He didn't say anything, just looked at me, then at her. His presence was enough to ground me, to remind me I was not in their house anymore. Sable stood and smoothed her jacket. Anyway, I should get going, but hey, Dad's company is hosting a dinner next week. You should come. He misses you. I blinked. Misses me? She placed a business card on the counter between us. He talks about you more than you think. He regrets how things ended. I stared at the card, her name embossed in gold, her number, a logo I hadn't seen in years. He missed me when I stopped being useful, I said, the words dry in my mouth. Sable smiled. Family's complicated, Elle, but it's still family. She left before I could reply. The door shut softly behind her. I stood there, holding the latte she never drank. Later that night, after the last customer had left and I'd finished mopping the floor, I opened my bag to pull out my keys and found an envelope I didn't recognize. Thick, cream-colored, expensive. My name printed across it, Ellen Hart. I sat on the cafe stool, still wearing my apron, the smell of coffee and cleaning spray still clinging to me. My fingers hovered over the flap, but I didn't open it, not yet. The lights dimmed as I flipped the last switch and caught my reflection in the window. Me, standing in a quiet cafe while raindrops began to tap softly on the glass outside. 3 months. That's all it took for ghosts to find me again. A week passed, but the envelope stayed exactly where I left it, on the kitchen table beside an empty coffee mug and yesterday's newspaper. I walked past it every morning, every night, pretending it wasn't there, pretending it didn't pull at the corner of my thoughts like a thread I was too afraid to tug. The evening light slanted through the blinds, cutting the room into neat bars of gold and shadow. The cafe downstairs had gone quiet. I could still smell the faint trace of espresso rising through the floorboards. I picked up the envelope. My name, or rather Ellen Hart, stared back at me in glossy print. I ran my thumb across the edge, then set it back down. They erased me, I whispered to no one, and now they want me to show up dressed like nothing happened. My phone buzzed. The screen lit up with an unknown number. Against my better judgment, I answered. Elowen, it's Mom. The sound of her voice froze me. I hadn't heard it in months, yet my body remembered the way it made my chest tighten, like holding your breath too long underwater. Mom, I said, keeping my voice flat, you're calling from a new number. I didn't think you'd pick up if you saw the old one. A soft laugh, brittle around the edges. Your father isn't well. He's been under a lot of stress lately. Maybe you could come just for him. I sat down slowly, the phone warm against my ear. He threw me out, Mom. He didn't mean it. Families say things in anger. He meant every word. She sighed, long and shaky, the kind of sigh that used to make me cave when I was little. Elowen, he's your father. He's getting older. He regrets things. I stared at the blinds, the golden light fading into gray. He regrets losing control, not losing me. A pause. Then, in that same rehearsed softness she'd always used when she wanted something, she said, We just want one photo together, for your father's legacy. Legacy. That word slid down my spine like ice. It wasn't about love, it was about image. It was about polishing the family name, about pretending the cracks weren't there. I leaned back in my chair, closing my eyes. You don't want me there, Mom. You want proof you tried. Elowen, please, she whispered. Just one night. For him. I didn't say yes. I didn't say no. But silence, I learned long ago, can be mistaken for agreement. After I hung up, I sat for a long time without moving. The hum of the refrigerator filled the room. Downstairs, the faint sound of a door closing told me Harlan was locking up for the night. When I finally walked down to the cafe, he was wiping the counter, sleeves rolled up, the radio playing some old country song in the background. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said. "Close enough." He looked up, waiting. "My mother called," I said. "They want me to come to a dinner, my father's company, some kind of reunion." His brow furrowed. "You planning to go?" "I don't know," I said. "Maybe I just want to see the look on their faces when I walk in." "Are you sure that's wise?" "No," I said, smiling faintly. "But sometimes you have to face the fire to stop it from following you." He studied me for a long moment, then nodded. "If you do go, don't go small. Walk in like you own the room." That night, back upstairs, I opened my closet. There wasn't much inside, a few worn shirts, a pair of jeans, an old black dress wrapped in plastic, the same one I'd worn the night my father threw me out. I slipped it off the hanger and held it up against myself in the mirror. The fabric still carried the faint scent of rain, or maybe that was just memory playing tricks. "Last time I wore this," I murmured, "I was the shame of the family. This time, I'll be their reflection." I turned the envelope over again. Something about it felt heavier now, like it carried more than paper. I tore it open carefully and a folded sheet slid out, a printed invitation embossed with my name. At the bottom, in fine print, "Guests of honor will be photographed for company media." I let out a breath that wasn't quite a laugh. "Of course," I said softly. "It's not a dinner, it's a publicity stunt." My chest tightened. Anger, sadness, something in between. They didn't want me back. They wanted to use me, again. I set the invitation down on the table and looked at my reflection in the darkened window. "If they want a photo," I whispered, "I'll give them one they'll never forget." I left my apartment just after 6. The dress I'd ironed the night before hung against my body like it had been waiting for this moment as long as I had. My heels clicked against the pavement with a confidence I didn't entirely feel, not yet. But it was there, underneath, curled up like a match waiting to be struck. Outside the hotel, valets in sharp black suits moved in practiced rhythm, opening doors, smiling wide. The kind of place where appearances weren't just valued, they were currency. I paused before stepping inside, pulled out my phone, and reread the message Harlan had sent that morning. "Sometimes silence isn't surrender, it's strategy." I slipped the phone back into my purse and walked through the glass doors. The ballroom was dripping in gold. Chandeliers sparkled overhead, casting warm light over rows of tables draped in ivory linen. Champagne flutes glinted. Laughter floated through the air, light and hollow. As I entered, heads turned. A beat of pause, then came the whispers. Soft, like wind through tall grass, but sharp, curious, and a little hungry. Sable was the first to approach. Of course she was. "Ellie," she sang, her arms outstretched like we were close. Her dress was sleek, white, designer. Her smile was curated, all teeth and no warmth. "You came, everyone. This is my sister, the creative one." There was a scattered round of polite clapping. I could feel the eyes, some intrigued, others scanning my body like I was a painting they weren't sure belonged in the gallery. I smiled, small but steady. "Thank you, Sable. You've built quite a legacy." She blinked, that perfect smile tightening a fraction before she turned to usher me further in. The air inside felt thick, too perfumed. Every conversation seemed staged, everyone too polished. I saw my mother across the room, standing near the buffet, picking at the hem of her sleeve like she used to when she was nervous. When she noticed me, she looked away. Then came my father. Alden Hart, sitting at a long table near the stage, surrounded by board members and smiling too hard. His suit looked tailored, his posture sharp, but his face was older than I remembered. Thinner. like time had chipped away at him while no one was watching. He took the microphone. "Tonight," he began, voice amplified through the room, "we celebrate more than success. We celebrate unity, vision, family." Every word landed like a slap. I stood still, tucked against the wall, hands clenched at my sides. Mara still wouldn't meet my eyes. And Sable leaned in close. "Smile, Elowyn," she whispered through her teeth. "There are cameras everywhere." I felt the click of one behind me. A photographer hovered, angling for the perfect shot of the perfect family. Then he stepped closer, holding out a small card. "This is for your placement," he said. I took it and looked down. Staff. Volunteer. My breath caught in my chest. I turned to Sable, who grinned. "You're part of the team, aren't you?" she said, voice syrupy. "Smile." But I didn't move forward. I stepped back instead, and the room noticed. Conversations dimmed. Silverware paused midair. Sable's eyes narrowed, and even my father leaned slightly forward, sensing the shift. I raised the card slowly, let it flutter to the ground like a leaf losing interest in the tree. "No," I said, loud enough to carry. "I'm not part of this team." The silence that followed was thick. My voice was calm, clear. "I built the first designs for your campaign last year, before I was told I wasn't family anymore, before I was thrown out like trash." There were murmurs now, uneasy shifting. A man in the crowd, I recognized him vaguely from an old client dinner, spoke up. "Wait, are you the Elowyn Hart, the one who designed the Roots project?" I nodded. "That was mine, until it wasn't." Sable opened her mouth, but I raised my hand slightly. "You wanted my silence so your image could shine. But tonight," I said, eyes moving from face to face, "I'm choosing honesty instead." Someone clapped. Just once, then again. Another joined. The ripple was quiet, but real. I looked at my father. His jaw was set, lips pressed tight. My mother was frozen, mascara trembling under her eyes. Sable. Her smile had cracked. I took one last glance around that glittering room. "Dinner's over," I said softly, and walked out. I didn't look back when I walked out of that ballroom. I didn't wait for applause or apologies or even a cab. I walked down the street, heels in hand, heart pounding but steady. I felt like I'd stepped out of a burning house barefoot, blistered but alive. 2 days passed. The Texas sky had turned a steely gray, the kind that presses against your windows like it's daring you to leave the house. Inside my apartment above the cafe, the quiet was thick with the weight of things left unsaid. Unopened envelopes cluttered the kitchen table. My phone blinked with voicemails I hadn't listened to. I wasn't sure I wanted to. Downstairs, the TV in the cafe played its usual background chatter. But this morning, something in the tone of the anchor's voice pulled me in. Hart and Sable PR scandal. Family rift exposed at gala. I turned toward the screen just as my own face appeared. The image was sharp. Me, standing still in the middle of a room full of luxury, speaking without raising my voice. Calm, defiant. Too calm, I thought. Like someone who'd finally stopped trying to be forgiven. Before the clip could finish, Harlan walked out from behind the counter and switched it off. He didn't say much. He never needed to. "They'll twist it," he said, handing me a cup of coffee. "They always do." I took the cup, fingers curled around the warmth. "I'm not afraid of the truth," I said. "Just their version of it." My phone buzzed again. I didn't need to check the screen to know who it was. Sable. I let it go to voicemail. Then it rang again. This time I picked up. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" she hissed. No hello. No pause. "You humiliated Dad in front of the investors. They're threatening to pull 2 major contracts." I stayed quiet for a beat. "He embarrassed himself," I said flatly. "I just stopped pretending it didn't happen." There was silence on the other end, followed by a scoff. You really think you're some kind of martyr? You were working in a coffee shop. Better than building an empire on someone else's silence. She hung up. 10 minutes later, another call came through. My mother. Her voice was already cracking before I could say anything. Elowen, sweetheart, please. I said nothing. We were trying to protect the family name, she sobbed. Your father, he's not well. You've ruined everything. I stared at the ceiling. Maybe that name needed to be ruined. I ended the call. By late afternoon, the cafe had quieted. The regulars had thinned out. Rain tapped gently against the windows. I was wiping down a counter when the front door opened. A man in a gray suit walked in, briefcase in hand. Elowen Hart? I nodded. He handed me an envelope. On behalf of Hart and Sable Incorporated. He didn't wait for a signature. Inside was a cease and desist letter. Legal jargon dressed up in threats. They were accusing me of defamation, of using company property without permission. I laughed, not because it was funny, it wasn't, but because I was too tired to be shocked. They stole my work, I said, showing Harlan the letter, and now they're suing me for it. He read it quietly, jaw tight. They're trying to scare you. They already did, once. The next day was worse. Online, the storm had hit full speed. Comments, headlines, old photos pulled from the internet. Strangers dissecting my life like it was a courtroom case. Some defended me, called me brave, bold. Others weren't so kind. Ungrateful daughter seeks attention. Typical, one tweet read. I shut the laptop. They erased me once. They're trying again, I whispered to the empty room. I didn't leave the apartment that evening. I didn't eat much either. I paced. I opened folders I hadn't looked at in months. Sketches, mood boards, early drafts of campaigns. All mine, all uncredited. Around midnight, I sat at my desk, hands hovering over the keyboard. My thumb rested on the delete key. One tap. That's all it would take. I was ready to erase everything. Years of design, work, memories, just so they couldn't use any more of it against me. But I didn't hear Harlan come in. He'd locked up the cafe and let himself upstairs. He didn't knock. He didn't need to. He just walked over, looked at the screen, then looked at me. They don't get to take your work twice, he said softly. My hands trembled. Then what do I do? He sat beside me. You fight, but smart this time. No more speeches, no more stage lights. I nodded, blinking back tears I hadn't realized were there. He left me alone then, not to push me, just to give me room to breathe. The apartment was silent again, except for the storm beginning to roll in outside. I looked at the screen, at everything I'd created, not for them, not even for the company, for me, and maybe for others like me, voices that were used, then discarded. I looked over at Harlan's note still pinned to the fridge. Sometimes silence isn't surrender, it's strategy. My voice was barely audible, but I meant every word. Then we'll give them the one thing they fear most, proof. 2 weeks later, the storm outside had finally given way to a gray, restless calm. Inside the cafe, though, the air still carried the charge of thunder. Papers were spread across the corner table. Sketches, printed emails, contracts I had found and reprinted. What had once been a place for warmth and routine now looked like a courtroom. My courtroom. Harlan sat across from me, reading over one of the files with quiet focus. His glasses had slipped down the bridge of his nose, the light above catching faint reflections in the lenses. This is enough to win a case, he said finally, setting the paper down. I didn't look up. My pen hovered above a note I'd been writing. I don't want a case, I said. I want the truth out there, in their own words. He nodded slowly. That's more dangerous. Truth usually is. For a long while, all that filled the cafe was the steady hum of the refrigerator and the soft scratch of my pen. I'd stopped shaking when I touched their names, Dad, Sable, the company, but every time I saw my own, scratched out or replaced, something deep in me still flinched. Then I opened a folder I hadn't looked at before. Old email archives from the company server. The files had been backed up automatically, buried under layers of junk messages. I clicked through one after another until I saw it. A thread titled Design Ownership. Urgent. The sender, Sable. The recipient, the company's legal counsel. The message read, "Erase Alohan's name from all records. The work needs to look like mine. Dad insists." I stared at the screen. The words didn't shock me. I'd suspected this for years, but seeing them, in writing, in their voices, was something else entirely. It wasn't anger that hit me. It was relief. Finally, something that couldn't be denied. I printed it, the sound of the machine loud and steady in the quiet cafe. My hands weren't trembling this time. They were steady, controlled. Harlan came over and glanced at the page. "That's it," he said quietly. "That's your proof." I nodded. "Then let's make sure it gets seen." Before I could reach for my phone, it rang. An unknown number, again. I almost let it go, but something told me to answer. "Elowen?" The voice cracked through the static. "It's your mother." I closed my eyes. "What do you want, Mom?" "Your sister knows," she said quickly. "She found out what you're doing. She's coming to see you. Please, don't make this worse." I almost laughed. "Mom, the truth isn't worse. It's just late." There was a pause, and then a quiet sob before the line went dead. I didn't have time to process it. The cafe door burst open, the bell above it clanging violently. Sable stood there, hair damp from the drizzle outside, eyes blazing. She didn't bother with greetings. "You're really doing this?" she demanded, voice sharp enough to cut through the air. "After everything Dad gave you?" I didn't rise. I just met her glare. "He gave me exile. You gave me silence." She took a step closer, slamming her bag down on the counter. "You think you're better than us now? Because you make lattes and play victim?" "No," I said, my tone even. "I just stopped pretending you were better than me." That stopped her for half a breath. Then she pulled something from her bag, a USB drive, and tossed it onto the table. "You want truth?" she spat. "Here's mine. That Roots campaign you're so proud of, I changed it. I made it profitable. Without me, you'd still be sketching on napkins." I looked at the small black drive, still spinning slightly from where it landed. Her voice had that familiar edge. Not pride, not hate, but desperation. "Do you hear yourself?" I said quietly. "You're still trying to convince me you deserve what you stole." She laughed bitterly. "You think this little crusade of yours makes you noble? You're going to destroy Dad's company, his life, our name." "Our name," I repeated, standing now. That name only ever meant something when it was spotless, and spotless meant someone else had to bleed for it. For a moment, she didn't move. Her lip trembled, the smallest flicker of uncertainty. I saw her then not as the golden child or the rival, but as the frightened woman she was underneath. A daughter still desperate to be loved by a man who only valued obedience. I picked up the drive. "Then we'll both tell our stories, Sable. Let the world decide whose truth survives." Her eyes burned, glassy and furious. "You'll regret this," she hissed, stepping back. "You're nothing without us." I exhaled slowly. "Funny," I whispered. "That's exactly what I used to believe." She turned and stormed out, the bell above the door ringing again, this time like a warning bell instead of a welcome one. The rain started again outside, light but steady. I sat back down, the USB in my hand, and stared at it for a long time before sliding it into my laptop. Harlan had been watching quietly from across the room. He didn't say a word, just gave me that small, knowing nod. The one that said he trusted I knew what came next. And I did. Because by midnight, the files, all of them, were on their way to a journalist. Not out of vengeance, but out of clarity. I wasn't trying to burn them down anymore. I was just done being invisible. I hit send. The email vanished into the ether, carrying years of designs, timelines, stolen credits, and the carefully worded truth I'd buried for too long. I didn't even breathe, just watched the little progress bar disappear like it had taken a part of me with it. The next 2 days moved like a silent earthquake. I didn't need to look far. It was everywhere. The article had exploded. My name, my face, that single photograph of me standing alone in the ballroom, they were all plastered across headlines, Twitter threads, business blogs. I stopped checking after a while. There's only so many ways you can hear the same sentence. Heart and Sable built its empire on a lie. By early Monday morning, the city felt different. Quiet, but charged, like everyone was holding their breath, waiting to see who blinked first. And then we drove downtown. I sat in the passenger seat while Harlan maneuvered the car past the first wave of cameras. The flash of bulbs caught in the glass building like little fires. The once untouchable Heart and Sable tower, glass, steel, and pride, now looked hollow. Everything about it felt temporary. He pulled up to the curb. "You sure?" "No," I said, grabbing my bag. "But I'm not turning back now." We walked through the storm of reporters, their questions flung like darts. "Elowen, is it true your father erased your name from company records? Are you suing? What do you say to people calling this a family vendetta?" I didn't answer a word. I didn't have to. My silence was louder than any statement they could twist. Inside, the building was a mess of whispers and panic. Employees avoided my eyes. Some stared too long. The air buzzed with uncertainty, a hive with no queen. I stepped into the elevator. Harlan didn't follow. This part I needed to do alone. The boardroom was on the top floor. I walked down the hallway slowly, deliberately. At the door, someone opened it for me. Not a receptionist, not security, just someone who knew I belonged here, whether they liked it or not. Inside, the table was packed. Executives, legal teams. And at the head, my father. Alden Hart looked thinner than I remembered, paler. His jaw clenched, fists on the table like they were holding him together. And Sable, sitting just off-center. Shoulders back, chin high, but her eyes darted unfocused. Her hand trembled against the folder in front of her. "You can't be here," she said, voice low and sharp. "I was here long before you tried to erase me," I replied, calm, steady, unshaken. I pulled the printed emails from my bag and placed them in front of the board chair. Every eye in the room shifted. My father didn't move. "This is defamation," he finally said, voice cracking but still trying for authority. "We built this company from the ground up." I looked at him, then at the papers. "You built it on lies, Dad." He looked like he wanted to argue, but the words never came. In the corner, my mother sat silently, hands clenched in her lap. Her eyes glistened. She hadn't said a word since I walked in. "Why now?" she finally whispered. "Because I finally realized silence doesn't heal anything," I answered. "It just hides the rot long enough for everything to collapse." There was a beat of pure stillness. Then the board chair pushed the papers back toward my father. "Mr. Hart," he said slowly, "the evidence is clear. The company will be distancing itself from your leadership, effective immediately." The silence that followed wasn't shock. It was confirmation. I watched it land on them, the weight of years, the truth they'd buried so deep, finally rising to the surface like a body that couldn't stay hidden anymore. Sable stared at the table. My father's face drained of color, and for the first time in my life, they both looked small, just people, not gods. He slammed the table. "You're no daughter of mine." I met his eyes. No fire, just truth. "You're right. I stopped being your daughter the night you threw me into the rain and told me I was dead to you." He blinked, stunned. Not because he forgot, but because I hadn't. My mother let out a soft cry. "Elowin, please. This isn't what we wanted." I turned to her, voice quiet but unwavering. "It's exactly what you created. You just didn't think it would bleed this far." I stood, slipping the final sheet back into my bag. I didn't need to be there anymore. As I turned to go, I saw him, the photographer from the gala, the same one who had labeled me staff with a plastic name card and a fake smile. He stood near the door, camera ready. "Ms. Hart?" he asked quietly. "May I take one last photo?" I nodded. No crowd, no spotlight. Just me. I looked straight into the lens. No anger, no apology. The click of the shutter felt like closure. When I stepped outside, rain had started again. Light, cold, but refreshing. Harlan stood under the awning with an umbrella. He said nothing, just offered the cover of it like a quiet promise. "You okay?" he asked. I thought for a second, then smiled faintly. "No, but I'm finally free." He didn't press further. He didn't need to. We walked toward the car slowly, the rain softening everything behind us. And somewhere behind those glass doors, the empire they built was already beginning to crumble. By the time we got back to the cafe, the rain had started to ease, leaving behind puddles that shimmered under the early city lights. I took off my coat and hung it by the door, watching Harlan disappear into the kitchen to make tea like he always did when he didn't have the words. I appreciated that about him. He never rushed me to feel better, never offered empty comforts. He just made tea and stayed. That night, I slept deeply for the first time in months. No dreams, no heaviness. Just a quiet kind of stillness, like my body had finally decided it was okay to stop bracing for impact. 3 weeks passed. In that time, the world outside spun like a storm on mute. News articles came and went. Heart and Sable was no longer a story. It was a cautionary tale. My inbox was filled with messages from strangers thanking me for speaking up, from designers who'd lost their voices to corporate theft. A few offers even came in. Collaborations, interviews, documentaries. I didn't say yes to any of them, not yet. I spent my days redesigning the cafe's branding, building a modest portfolio for freelance work. Nothing flashy, just quiet, honest projects that felt like mine. Most mornings I opened the place alone, humming softly as I arranged pastries and wiped down the counter. That morning, the air still carried the weight of last night's storm. Thick, damp, but gentle. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside, flipping on the lights. Golden rays filtered through the windows, glinting off water drops still clinging to the glass. It was the kind of morning that felt like a breath being held. There, on the table by the window, the one I usually sat at when I needed to think, was an envelope, plain white, slightly wrinkled at the corners, no return address, just my name, written in a hand I hadn't seen in years, but recognized instantly. Elowin, no greeting, no flourish. Just my name, centered and alone, like a quiet knock on a door that had been closed too long. I made my coffee before sitting down. Some part of me needed the ritual, something warm in my hands before touching that letter. I sat for a long time, staring at it, tracing the handwriting with my eyes. I didn't open it right away. I let it sit beside my cup, as though giving it time to explain itself. Eventually, I slid my thumb under the flap and pulled out the single sheet of paper. My mother's handwriting was smaller than I remembered, more hesitant, but still neat. I don't know how to ask for forgiveness, so I won't. "You were right. We built a house out of pride, and it collapsed because it had no love. Take care of yourself, my brave girl." Mom, I didn't cry, not out of coldness or defiance. I just didn't need to. The tears had already come and gone in waves these past few weeks. This wasn't a wound anymore. It was a scar, one I had decided not to hide. I folded the letter carefully. From the drawer behind the counter, I pulled out a napkin. Old, soft from time and creases. Harlan had given it to me months ago, when I first walked into the cafe with nothing but my silence. On it, in his handwriting, were 5 words I never forgot. "You're not broken, you're rebuilding." I placed my mother's letter inside the folds of that napkin, then tucked them both into a tin box I kept near the register, the one where I kept notes, thank you cards, reminders that life wasn't always cruel. Later that morning, while restocking shelves near the front window, I noticed her. A girl, maybe 22, standing across the street with a duffel bag and a phone pressed to her ear. Her voice cracked even though I couldn't hear her. She was shaking her head, wiping her eyes with the back of her sleeve. Whoever was on the other end wasn't listening. I knew that look, the heartbreak of being unheard. The confusion of realizing the people you love the most are the ones who leave you standing in the rain. I stepped outside. The air was still damp, the street shiny and slick. I grabbed an umbrella from the stand and walked toward her. "You all right?" I asked softly. She startled, trying to pretend she wasn't crying. "Yeah, just waiting for a ride." I didn't press. I just held out the umbrella. "It's not much, but the coffee's hot. You're welcome to come in and sit for a bit." She looked at me like she didn't quite know whether to trust it. Then, slowly, she nodded. Inside, the bell above the door jingled. Same soft sound it had made 3 months ago when I walked in for the first time. I poured 2 cups, slid one across the counter toward her. She didn't say thank you right away, just wrapped her hands around the mug like it was the only warm thing in her world. I leaned back against the counter and watched the street outside turn gold under the rising sun. Sometimes, life doesn't give you closure, it gives you echoes. And if you're lucky, they sound a lot like peace.